Welcome to anyone watching, it's Craig at mysimpit.co.uk. Now that the Simpit project has reached the stage of core project completion, in this video we'll first of all take a look at the completed Simpit. We'll go through its startup cycle, we'll take a look at it in use, and then I'll add some comments in terms of what is it like to live with, and then a critical view of its functionality, what's good, but where are the deficiencies, and then what future upgrades I would have in mind. Let's buckle up. What we can see now is the Simpit at the stage of core project completion. I wouldn't apply the term finished to it because I don't think it will ever be finished. But when I say core project completion, I say that in so much as that stage represents the fulfillment of the initial scope outline for the project, which was to create and fully replicate all of the key functionality of four main parts: the left console, right console, front dash, and the flight seat. With those now done, this represents a key milestone in the Simpit project. I'll now take it through its startup cycle. This is a Simpit in a cold and dark state. I've added some dust covers. I'll mention a little bit more about the website name later on with the upgrades. At this point the Simpit is all up and running. So that means that the Simpit's fully powered up. We have the left and right MFCDs and the RWR as exported displays. We have 12 connected microcontrollers, all of which are being streamed data. They have all come online and are functioning correctly. We'll just take a moment to have a look around the Simpit now that the startup cycle's completed. With the startup cycle now done for the Simpit, I'll just take my time now to bring the systems of the A10 online. I won't follow any particular order, I'll take my time so we can see the Simpit in use, and I'll just work my way through the different systems and extinguish all the lights on the caution light panel.
Pull up. Altitude, altitude.
At this point, the Simpit's been through its full startup cycle and the systems of the A10 have been initialised. So it's now time to jump in. Each time I get in and out of the Simpit, I'm able to use the electronic seat to move forward and back and position it as needed. Also, the height can be altered and tilt. So I can move it here right up against the flight control stick. I'll now go ahead and set my backlighting. Whereas in daytime flight, all of the backlighting being off, and at nighttime flight, all of the backlighting being on, I tend to like, even during daytime flight, the upfront controller, control display unit, and both of the MFCDs to have all of those tactile switches backlit, because by doing that it really punctuates the text of those smaller buttons. And as we can see now, I throw power to the right and left consoles and the front dash. I can then control the brightness of different areas of the cockpit. So it gives you a good degree of control of the different areas. Up until when I made the right console, all of the backlighting was just in a state of either on or off, but the brightness can be so great that just having it on at full brightness can be quite piercing, so it's good to be able to get it to an appropriate level. And also even the brightness of the MFCDs can be altered. We'll just go ahead and do a lamp test. I'm really pleased with the way the version 2 of the caution light panel came out. Yeah, having those 2 LEDs per window makes a big difference. We'll just take a moment now to have a close-up look at some of the controls and panels. I think a red LED to show the power status of the ILS panel is a nice addition. The dual concentric rotor encoder's a nice one to use. Looks the business. I'm glad I got an alphanumeric display in for the TACAN panel. I think that works well. For the avionics auxiliary panel, it was nice to put in some really good toggles which were from a Tornado panel that I stripped down. I've mentioned a few times before, I really love the vacuum filled displays. I'd say definitely get one in your Simpit if you can. In fact, I like this so much I ended up using it for the CMSP and the CMSC. And it's nice to put a few real aircraft knobs in place. This one again off a Tornado panel. The EMI engine monitoring instruments, I actually built 2 of these. I had a version 1 which was a prototype, and this was a version 2. So this one was a custom fit for the front dash frame, but also it had changes in the way it was driven. It was over a PCB based RS485 network, but then it was using multiple steppers per microcontroller. For anyone that wants to build a mechanical ADI, definitely make sure you got movement to the sphere because of line of sight. The landing gear panel is always one of my favourites, with a magnetically held switch and a real landing gear lever from a Tornado. Moving round to look at the left console, it's a bit like looking back in time because It was the first ever one that I built. I look at the radio stack, and that was one that was before I did any PCBs of my own, and sort of underneath the depth of it is like an iceberg. It's absolutely huge as a unit, and I use extra large 7-segment displays, which, although I do it differently if I was to do it again, I do kind of like some of these as they are, because it gives it a bit of a personality. I also added in a couple of rows of extra controls, which I'll just turn the backlighting off for those, and then I'll switch it back on. And you can see how they blend in. I always wanted it so once they're switched off, it's not like normal text on any of the panels where you can just see the white text. I wanted it to fade away. And these are wired in through the keyboard encoder, so they control a number of different shortcuts. One thing that the camera doesn't pick up is the clarity of the text, that you can read quite clearly what the shortcuts are. We'll take a look at the standby attitude indicator. A fair bit of work to fully replicate its functionality, considering its prominence and usage in the cockpit, but offers a lot of learnings as a build up to building the full ADI. Got the clock of the A10, just run through a simple OLED in this case. UHF panel, again just with a straightforward OLED. The CMSC, again, definitely got a vacuum filled display in there. And as I look at this and I start to look around, I start to see and have in mind some of the improvements and upgrades which I'd like to make, and that's something I'll come to shortly for us to cover. The nav panel, these switches have a nice good feel and click to them. The UFC, moving on from the MFCDs, it was good to spend time to really try and refine the engraving of the text, just so it's much clearer. Electric and oxygen panels, straightforward. Much like the UFC, good bit of time spent getting the engraving of the buttons all correct. I ran tests with a whole heap of different screens, but this one worked out really well. And these small tactile switches, which have an LED within them, really good filter, nice and clicky, good clear movement of them. So you get that good tactile feedback when using this keypad, which, particularly for a keypad where you might quickly be typing in a whole string of characters, it's good to be able per press to know that it's input correctly. And when building it, it's really taking the time to be sure you've got the free movement of the cap, that it fits comfortably within the hole that you've made for it, but that it never sticks. So definitely worth the extra time spent on this one. For the canopy eject, I had in mind I wanted a 2-stage lever, one to prime it, second to jettison. Whilst airborne, let's take a look at the hood. It can easily be aligned in flight and it gives a nice effect. We'll take a look at the standby attitude indicator and also that relative to the normal attitude director indicator. And you can see by me altering the alignment of that, it now is out of kilter to the main one, which shows that they do run separate to one another. So the standby indicator acts as independent attitude verification. But I think it was good to go to the lengths to recreate the both of these. And I'll just move the camera to get a view of what it's like to use in flight operation. I'm now going to trigger a couple of caution warning lights. I do like the effect of these geared servos for the hydraulics. That sudden sharp movement, just like what's in the sim. Let's have a look at the mechanism of pulling one of the fire handles. And in fact, let's kill the aircraft. I'll pull the left one and we can see the effect of that. And did you hear? That was a magnetically held switch as it flips position for the anti-collision function. And things like this, these type of components, I think it adds just so much to bring the aircraft alive. So something worth thinking about is what happens when the Simpit's all up and running, all of the data streams are in effect, so all of the data is being streamed to all of the various panels, and then something occurs within a mission to suddenly bring it to an end, and you're taken out of the mission and you relaunch it. Well, the good thing is you won't need to restart any of those data streams again. Everything in the cockpit reflects its final state at the point it stopped, and then at the point you restart the mission and the data streams automatically feed through and the whole cockpit state updates. So let's see that happen now.
Warning, autopilot.
So an event occurs like this that brings a mission to an end. And then we restart a mission. So let's say, for example, I relaunch it but for nighttime operations. The cockpit state reflects whatever it was at the final point that it could stream the data, or resume a new mission, and the data streams feed through new data and it all updates. So generally, once a Simpit's up and running, it should just run continuously and shouldn't need to have relaunches of data streams, unless in the very unlikely event they drop out, which to be honest is very rare. And that could be one of the benefits of an RS485 network, that all of those extra microcontrollers that are connected don't have that overhead of having all those extra COM ports on the computer. So let's get airborne as best as I can whilst holding the camera. And what we'll see here is the use of the landing gear panel, which I do think, having that real lever from a Tornado all interfaced, again, such a good clunk to it as it's used. And I like that it's even used the original bulbs within it for the illumination. So we'll take a look at a few other instruments close up whilst it's in flight, and then we'll move along to looking at what the Simpit's like to live with. And I'll just finish with a close-up of the landing gear panel through the whole of the sequence of lowering the undercarriage and raising it. Most Simpits will need an element of maintenance, and the bigger the Simpit and the more complex it is, the more that will be needed. We can see here a scenario I've had where the 7-segment display for the ILS, its readout, and the vacuum fill display for the countermeasures aren't functioning. And this is a good example of a time where you need to access these panels and diagnose the issue. So let's take a look. So we can see from a maintenance point of view that it's important that all consoles are easily accessible, as light as possible, and ideally on wheels. In this case, the cause was quite easy to determine and the fix was straightforward. The power up of the Simpit has to follow a particular sequence, and with finishing off the project and moving a lot of the cabling around, it wasn't in quite the right order. A quick reset of the microcontrollers has fixed the issue, and going forward I've relabelled the plugs in terms of the power up cycle. With that issue addressed, as always, I can't help myself, I run a few more diagnostics. I do like my diagnostics and testing. Thinking about the Simpit, I can't say that it on the whole needs a lot of maintenance, but some occasionally is required, and I would tend to say that it's more so needed where you're dealing with instruments with moving parts. I'll just take a moment to show some of the extra wiring of the Simpit whilst the console's pulled out. Both of these here are monitoring instruments for the RS485 networks. Earlier on in their usage, I was keen to understand their power consumption and also to have a kill switch in place. The monitoring panel for the engine monitoring instruments, that was one where I also added the ability to be able to cycle any Arduino individually to reset particular gauges. And we can now see a good bit of the wiring here. So earlier on its design, I decided I wanted a hub, and that hub would contain effectively most of the controllers, which we can sort of see here. With this being my first proper Simpit project, it's more of an evolution, so I'm at a point that I would tend to want to gravitate away from this now, that I'd rather all of the content of this was simply embedded under the panels and in the consoles, and that would avoid all of this massive wiring to it. In terms of the maintenance of this, it's pretty straightforward. You can access it via the side, so we'll come in and take a look, and we can see some of the initial setup. Let's shine a light on it. Now, interesting, what we've got here is the first ever RS485 network I built, and it was actually hand wired at the time, no PCBs. And although that sits in the cabinet, that's not in use at the moment. It's legacy kit. It's there if I ever want to tap into it for the functionality, but it's been superseded by PCBs. And the rest of the cabinet has 3 keyboard encoders, another Arduino, the Ethernet switch, and a couple of power supplies. I've also got some cabling ready at the front, so if I want to map any other switches to the simulator in the future, they're ready to plug in and off I go. Right, let's just go ahead and pop the side on. The keyboard encoders, which is the main component that comprises what's within this hub, is what then is fed through all of these cables through to the back of the panels. It's all Cat5 wiring, and it primarily feeds into the left console and also the upfront controller, part of the glare shield and the MFCDs. We can see the back of the glare shield there, where I've designed everything so it can just be unplugged and then lift off if you need to access inside the front dash. And then we've got all of the cabling relating to the lighting, which we can see here. The power supplies go into the right console, and from there those power supplies feed through a master lighting panel and then branch out via those wires through all of the Simpits, all the different panels and consoles. So we'll take some time now to look at the positives and the deficiencies that exist within the Simpit. In terms of positives, the original scope of cockpit replication has been achieved. Multiple methods have been used to drive the Simpit, and that allows for best fit solutions. So whether that's the RS485 network minimising the overhead of COM ports, or the keyboard encoders allowing extra functions to be mapped, and the possibility of using other simulators with the Simpit. Real aircraft parts have been used, so the magnetically held switches are a great addition, and the Tornado landing gear lever and various switches were actually stripped down from actual Tornado panels and work really well. There's a physical recreation of the IAS, ADI, HSI, VVI, altimeter and EMI. The circuit breaker panel has all of the circuitry implemented at the back ready for a future upgrade. There's an adjustable and comfortable flight seat, so in this case it can be moved backwards and forwards, but also it's got tilt and height adjust, so you can get in the right seating position and move right up against the flight control stick. There are 2 tactile transducers installed in that, which allow the output from the simulation of vibration to reflect what's happening in the aircraft is to good effect. There's an enhanced lighting control via a master lighting control panel, and that allows brightness of different areas to be fully controlled, as well as individual control of additional lighting, like within the sphere of the ADI and the flood lighting for the HSI. There's robust frame builds. The TACAM panel has utilised an alphanumeric display, which is great because it allows you to display all of the characters and text. The CMSP and CMSC utilise vacuum filled displays that work really well. There's the dedicated Warthog HOTAS system, which has had an extension to the flight control stick, but in every other way is standard, works really well. Additional configurable and mappable controls have been installed, but there is a scope to add more, so it's ready for that into the future, to future-proof it. There's the dedicated space for maps, keyboard, mouse and other materials. Fully documented build to assist future maintenance, so if at some point in the future I need to revisit almost any panel here, I've got diagrams, schematics and images and notes related to everything I've built to assist. Dedicated monitoring instruments installed, supported by self-defined operational rules for functional safety. So around certain things like RS485 networks, I installed panels to monitor the power consumption and other aspects of it and the ability to cut all power to it. And with the flight seat having a powerful electronic base underneath, again there's a kill switch, but I've set in place certain steps that mean that my feet and my legs would always be clear of where there's a movement to the chair. There are some minor deficiencies and imperfections, and those ones, the most minor of them, do not impact material operation, and I'll give some examples of those shortly, but if anything, those ones, they just give the Simpit a personality. And of course the final positive is, above all else, it's really cool. Now in terms of the deficiencies, the left console and the radio stack also within that console aren't scaled correctly. They're about the actual console itself is about 250 millimeters too long, and the radio stack's just generally elongated. It did deviate from the correct scale due to the way the components were arranged and using larger 7-segment displays. The EMI of the 12 gauges there's just one that's got a small amount of needle slip. The airspeed indicator, the decimals rotary, isn't rotating freely, and the gauge scaling is incorrect if I'm going to use an X27 style stepper. The ADI steering bars need some further configuration. The HSI, the rotating markers, particularly the ones around the outer edge, were catching one another, and the flight deviation needle is not working. That was one that I created prior to the steering bars for the ADI, so the learnings were not in place at that time. The front dash panel footprints are large, so that means they extend into the cavity quite some way of the front dash, so that the front dash itself, when you lift off the glare shield, is just very densely populated with all the wiring, so it does impact maintenance. The left console and front dash aren't on wheels, so there is quite some weight, so not easy to move around. The SAS panel, there are no magnetically held switches in that at the moment. The oxygen panel and environmental panels, the gauges in those aren't configured at the moment, and a couple of them don't have pointers on. The keyboard encoders, when they're driving a 2-position switch, and it's for a mapped function that DCS itself is limited in the extent to which it can map it, the keyboard encoder doesn't know its position, so it's possible that when you flip that switch either way, it may move it in the sim either way, but it could be out of sync and at opposites with the sim. It's easy to correct, but DCS BIOS does not have that challenge. The RWR, the monitor within that now has to have its own power supply and a AV to USB converter, so there is quite some unnecessary wiring and complexity to that one. It was also very finicky in the setup of it. Engraving of the MFCD tactile caps is not particularly well defined, and they were the first ones created. The upfront controller and the CDU, they had improvements taken forward into those. The fuel panel, now this does have a loose connection for the backlighting, but it's only one strip of the 4 strips of lighting, and it's intermittent, so when it does happen on those rare occasions, it's really a minimal impact. So I've put that as not material. It's not material to the operation of the Simpit or the aircraft. And the final one will be that other deficiencies will be present, and it's a question of extended flight testing is needed to be able to uncover those. In terms of future upgrades and those that are intended, the first is to configure the extra controls that I've already put into the flight seat and to map those to functions within the sim. Following that, to configure the gauges for the oxygen and environmental panels, and to replace the SAS panel switches for magnetically held ones, because that was to really good effect for the anti-skid function and the anti-collision. I plan to install a utility light at the back rear of the left console, and then to configure the ADI steering bars. And at this point I've rated that one moderate because the scope of work's a lot more involved, that I'd remove the glare shield, remove several instruments to get to it, to remove it from the front dash, do the works which may have a little bit to them, and then reinstall it. I plan to look at the whole sound setup, as the sound now is just coming from the TV that's a monitor, so perhaps some kind of a surround system. To install magnetically held switch into the throttle unit, and I have to be careful that in doing that I don't damage that unit. To build a version 2 of the RWR, and in doing that it would change the display to one that's an LCD screen, which will change the way it's interfaced to the computer and greatly simplify it. I plan to build a version 2 of the HSI, and at this point the scope of that work is extensive because I want to improve and have greater functionality and more effective functionality. A big one beyond that too is to implement a new visual setup, and that is extensive because that would be to look at, do I extend the visual setup to be 3 monitors, or am I looking at 3 projectors and a curved display? Or at that point, how are the virtual reality headsets coming along? Is that something that would be a possibility? And then also another extensive item of works would be to update my website. So as shown at the start of this video on the dust covers, it showed the website address as mysimpit.com, and to this point it's been .co.uk. So I have the domain for .com, and the plan into the future is to do an upgraded and updated website at .com. And that will also into the future as well document other Simpits built, because the whole nature of the Simpits I plan to build is not just this one for the A10C, it could be to replicate any cockpit environment. In terms of other upgrades beyond this, I'll then move on to ones that are ideal to do, time permitting, and the first of those would be to access the engine monitoring instruments to correct that one needle that's got a bit of slip. But even for such a minor change, that's one that's actually minor to moderate in the scope of works. For the circuit breaker panel, when I installed that, although it's non-functional at the moment, it's got all of the circuitry at the back for me to wire it up and bring that online, but I do expect that to be quite a moderate piece of work as well. I'd like to replace a driver board on the left multifunction colour display, because I have noticed right back from when I had it originally, it does give off a bit of a high pitch hum. Now it's not one you can hear when everything else is running, but I had exactly the same on the right MFCD, and some time ago I changed that driver board and it actually fixed a problem. I plan to build a version 2 of the airspeed indicator, and in doing that the decimal rotary will have free rotation, and I'll alter the scaling for the gauge for the marker lines to accommodate an X27, or I'll leave it as it is for the scaling, but I'll put a different stepper in with a different range of motion. I'd like to look at building a radio stack version 2. Now at that point I think that would go beyond just saying let's correct the scaling of the one that's already there. It may as well be that it's the radio stack from the A10 and that the Simpit can transition to the A10C too. I'd like to mount the front dash on wheels, but that could potentially be moderate to extensive, because if the height of that's altered, everything else has to be raised, including the left console and the right console that's already on wheels and the seat. So it's quite a piece of work for that one. To replace the MFCD tactile caps. So a lot of the work there is just to produce them and then to take out what's currently housed, the MFCDs that are already in there, and to access that. So it's to dismantle everything and to build it back up is what makes that a more moderate to extensive piece of work. To consider potentially at some point building a fully working hood. Now that's an extensive item of work, and that would have to occur after I've fully changed and updated the full display and chosen on that, so whether it's a 3 projectors or whatever it might be, because the hood then needs to be configured to run in line with that new display setup. In terms of the hub, which is a data cabinet that had all of the various CAT cabling that came from it, primarily from the keyboard encoders, I'd like to remove that and to migrate to fully localized wiring and much greater use of DCS BIOS. So that's an extensive piece of work, but as an outcome, it would massively simplify all of the wiring and save that space at the side. And I'd like, at some point, to try and incorporate advanced PCB design to reduce the front dash panel footprints. Now that would be extensive because that's revisiting a number of them, but the benefit would be that the footprints would be much smaller and the cavity that exists within the front console, the front dash, would be a lot less populated, so it's a lot easier to access different panels and work on them and to maintain them and upgrade them. I'd also like to try and at some point install new rudder pedals, but that is an extensive item of work because given how they're installed, they are embedded in that front console underneath everything else. So there'd be quite a piece of work to get to it, but then the footprint that exists for new rudder pedals to go in would need to be very similar to the one taken up by the current pedals. And then finally, to possibly at some point build the left console of version 2, where I think following a rebuild of the radio stack, that would make sense then to rebuild the left console with the correct scaling, a reduced weight, and it would be on wheels just like the right console. Now with regard to the upgrades, the intended upgrades are ones that in the future I definitely would likely do, although for timescales it could be a little bit into the future. The ideal or time permitting ones are ones that, as well, it's weighing up the value gained relative to the time put in. So I think that looking at those, the correcting the needle slip, is it worth the time and effort? Possibly not unless some of the other ones start to slip. The circuit breaker panel, I think that's worth the time for that one. I've done them so they're individually addressable, so upon any circuit breaker being tripped, it would actually illuminate red and have a push button to reset it. So I think that would be worth the time. I think it would be worth replacing the driver board. The airspeed indicator, yeah, because there's a number of aspects of that one that aren't quite right. The radio stack, I think doing that would probably be really based on my appetite to progress to the A10C too, so I'll see. I think mounting things on wheels for the front dash, I think for that one, if I was to achieve the other bits of the reduced footprints, that would reduce the weight sufficiently that you could move it around a lot easier without wheels, so I think it might be tied to some extent with that. The MFCD caps, I think I'd have to be at a point that I'd got so much done to actually do that one. But there is something I'd like to improve, but I'm not sure it would warrant the time on that one. A working HUD, that would be probably one of the final things ever done. That's really the icing on the cake. The removal of the data cabinet, again, it's a lot of work for something that in one sense you don't immediately benefit from just operating the Simpit, but I think it would greatly tidy all of the wiring and make it more efficient and effective in that regard. And then beyond that, the full build of the left console again, even if I change a radio stack, perhaps on reflection, that's one that I'd have to be at a point that I'd almost done everything. So I was almost thinking, right, I have the appetite to do that. So I think there's a number of upgrades that could happen into the future. Some intended and the others are on a nice to-do list. And we'll see how that goes. As the core project's effectively complete, we now come to the part of reflecting on the journey and the build to this point. Before thinking of the Simpit, the first thing is to think about Digital Combat Simulator, and I always find with that the graphics and all the detail are exceptionally well done. And I'll just bring up a few screenshots where at the time what I saw, the visuals, really struck me. I also rate highly the extent to which the systems are modelled. I mean, thinking about the first ever computer I ever had, or the first console, it was an Atari 2600, I think of the games I played on that, and this now, it's, yeah, amazing. Even the movement of blades of grass are modelled. And whether I'm on my way to deploy mass ordnance, or I'm on my way back having deployed mass ordnance, there's nothing like taking in the sights. A nice sunset. Let's take a look at an external view and the damage modelling. And beyond all this, how great are the sound effects? So I think Digital Combat Simulator as a simulator is just a really great environment to operate in. A real pleasure to use.
Upper left, upper left.
As regards reflections on the Simpit, I think it comes down to just a couple of key things. I think if I was to do this over again, I would not have that data cabinet to act as a hub. I think all of the wiring would be localized and it would primarily be DCS BIOS, perhaps just with a single keyboard encoder. All consoles would be mounted on wheels for ease of moving around. And I think generally just in the approach to building anything like this is just try to keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate, and wherever there's moving parts, only have them where you really feel it adds a value, because they're the bits typically that will need the maintenance. And whilst for me, I'm glad that I recreated the front dash by physically creating each panel within it, but I do think that the route of a glass cockpit, there's a lot to be said for that, and I think typically for most builders that probably would be the way to go. So this project's one that has run for 5 years, and during that time it's been amazing to build and fantastic to fly. I've learnt loads along the way, and that will help me to be able to do the upgrades to this in the future and for other projects that I'll look to do. Along the way I've thanked people for any help that's been given with particular panels, usually where there was an item of code shared or something like that. But at this point, as I take a step back, I really would like to thank all of the people that follow me on YouTube and been really supportive in all of your comments, and that you followed the journey with me. I'd like to thank my father-in-law, who's an engineer, for his knowledge and his input and all the time that we spent together to machine things on his CNC, and also some of the woodworking aspects. It's really appreciated. Thanks, Phil. And above all else, I'd like to thank my wife for her patience in understanding my need to build this. Thank you. I plan to take some time now to enjoy the Simpit as it is at this stage, and then into the future I'll revisit it in terms of the upgrades, and I'll look to share them at that time. Thanks for watching.